The stagecoach lurched over a rut deep enough to swallow a wagon wheel whole, and Nellie Shelton pressed her forehead against the window glass, watching the dust of the Wyoming Territory rise like smoke behind them. It was the spring of 1878, and she had traveled nearly 900 miles from Ohio to become a bride nobody wanted. She knew the truth of it now, though she had not known it when she boarded the train in Columbus with her mother's cameo brooch pinned to her collar and a satchel full of hope. The advertisement in the newspaper had promised a good man, a working ranch, a life of purpose. It had not promised that the man in question, one Silas Crandall, would take one look at her plain brown dress and her narrow shoulders and declare to the whole depot that he had ordered a wife, not a scarecrow. "I never asked to be beautiful," she had told him, her voice shaking but her chin lifted. "I asked to be given a chance." Silas Crandall had laughed, a short, ugly bark of a sound, and turned his back on her right there on the platform in the town of Larkspur, leaving her standing with her trunk and her pride and nothing else. The other women who had come on the same bridal train, 3 of them, pretty things with curled hair and easy laughs, had been claimed within the hour by ranchers eager for wives. Nellie had watched them go, watched the men's faces light with satisfaction, and she had understood something bitter and clear. Some women were chosen because they were wanted, and some were left behind because they were not. She was 22 years old, and she had told herself on the long ride west that this would be the start of something new. Instead, it felt like the end of something she had never gotten to begin. The depot agent, a kind but harried man named Mr. Pruitt, had not known what to do with her. He had wired ahead to the matchmaking agency in Cheyenne, but a reply would take days, and in the meantime Nellie sat on a bench outside the telegraph office with her trunk beside her feet, watching the dust settle on the boots of men who did not look at her twice. It was there that Homer Walden found her. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders from years of ranch work, with sun-browned skin and eyes the color of good strong coffee. He had come into Larkspur to collect a shipment of fencing wire and had heard, from the mouth of the blacksmith, about the woman left standing on the platform like a piece of unclaimed baggage. He had not meant to go looking for her, but something about the story had caught in his chest and would not let go, and so he had walked to the depot with his hat in his hand, not entirely sure what he intended to say. He found her sitting very straight, her hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing. "Ma'am," he said, and she looked up at him with eyes that were red-rimmed but dry, as though she had decided crying would not help her now. "I heard what happened. I am sorry for it. You need not apologize for another man's cruelty," she said. Her voice was steady, though he could hear the effort it took to keep it so. "It is not your burden." "No," he agreed, "but I do not like to see a person left sitting on a bench like forgotten mail." He turned his hat over in his hands. "My name is Homer Walden. I have got a ranch about 6 miles north of here, the Walden Spread near Rattlesnake Creek. I came into town for wire and nails, and I am headed back before dark." "That is a fine thing for you, Mr. Walden," Nellie said, "but I do not see what it has to do with me." "It has this to do with you," he said, and he crouched down so that he was level with her, so that she would not have to look up at him like he was some tower passing judgment. "I have got room in my wagon, and I have got a spare room in my house that has sat empty since my mother passed 3 years back. I am not offering you charity, Miss Shelton, Nellie Shelton. Miss Shelton, I am offering you a place to stay until the agency in Cheyenne sorts out what is to be done with you, and I am offering it because no person ought to be left on a bench like a sack of flour nobody wanted." Nellie studied him for a long moment. There was nothing in his face that resembled pity, and that surprised her more than the offer itself. Pity she had braced for, pity she could have refused. But he looked at her the way a man looks at a problem that deserves solving, not a broken thing that deserves mourning, and something in her chest loosened just slightly. "I was never meant to be chosen," she said quietly, more to herself than to him, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "Not by him, not by anyone. I have known that a long while now, Mr. Walden, and I have made my peace with it." Homer Walden did not answer right away. He looked at her for a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes, something that looked like anger on her behalf, though he kept his voice gentle. "Well," he said at last, standing and offering her his hand to help her rise, "I do not know what peace looks like when it is built on another man's foolishness, but I know this. You are coming to my ranch tonight because it is getting dark and this town is no place for a woman alone, and we will figure the rest out come morning. That is not charity, Miss Shelton. That is just sense." She took his hand. It was rough and warm and steady, and she let him help her to her feet, and together they loaded her trunk into the back of his wagon among the coils of fencing wire, and she climbed up onto the seat beside him, and they rode north out of Larkspur as the sky turned orange and then purple over the endless grass. Neither of them spoke much on that first ride. The land rolled by, wide and empty, broken by stands of cottonwood along the creek and the distant shapes of grazing cattle. Nellie kept her hands folded in her lap and watched the horizon, and Homer kept his eyes on the road, and if he glanced at her once or twice when he thought she was not looking, she pretended not to notice. The Walden ranch house came into view just as the last light was fading, a sturdy structure of timber and stone with a wide porch and a barn behind it that looked freshly repaired. Smoke curled from the chimney. A dog barked from somewhere near the barn and came bounding out to meet the wagon, an old speckled hound who nearly knocked Homer over with enthusiasm. "That is Biscuit," Homer said, allowing himself the first real smile Nellie had seen from him. "He is not much of a guard dog, but he has got a good heart." "He seems to like you very much," Nellie said, and there was the faintest warmth in her voice now, the first crack in the wall she had built around herself since the platform in Larkspur. "He likes anybody who feeds him," Homer said. "Come on inside. I will get a fire going and see what there is to eat. It is not much of a house for a lady, I am afraid. Just me here since my mother passed." The house was simple but clean, with a large main room that served as kitchen and parlor both, a stone fireplace, a table with two mismatched chairs, and a narrow staircase leading up to what Nellie assumed were the bedrooms. There were curtains at the windows, faded but carefully mended, and Nellie suspected they had been sewn by the mother Homer had mentioned. "It is more than I expected," she said honestly. "I thought I would be sleeping on that bench tonight." "You will not be sleeping on any bench while I have got breath in me," Homer said, and then, as though embarrassed by his own vehemence, he busied himself with the fire. He showed her to the spare room upstairs, small but tidy, with a narrow bed and a washstand and a window that looked out over the dark fields. He apologized for the thin quilt, promised to find her a warmer one from the cedar chest, and left her alone to settle in while he went to see to the horses. Alone in the small room, Nellie sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself to cry, quietly, into her hands, not from despair, but from the strange, disorienting relief of having survived a day that had threatened to break her. She cried for the humiliation of the platform, for the long journey that had brought her to this unfamiliar place, and for the small, unexpected kindness of a stranger who had crouched down to meet her eyes instead of looking down on her. Downstairs, Homer Walden stood in his own kitchen and stared at the fire for a long while, thinking about the way she had said those words. "I was never meant to be chosen." He did not know much about the workings of a woman's heart, having buried his mother and never taken a wife of his own, but he knew injustice when he heard it, and something about the flatness in her voice, the way she had accepted it as simple fact, had settled into his chest like a stone and would not shift loose. He was still thinking about it 3 days later. In that time, Nellie had made herself useful around the ranch in ways that surprised him. She had cleaned the house from top to bottom, mended the curtains further, taken over the cooking with a skill that made his simple meals of beans and salt pork seem like feasts by comparison, and even helped him mend a section of fence along the east pasture, holding the wire steady while he hammered the staples home. "You do not have to do all this," he told her on the third evening, as she set a plate of stew before him at the table. "You are a guest here, not a hired hand." "I cannot sit idle, Mr. Walden," she said, taking her own seat across from him. "It is not in my nature. Besides, I owe you a debt for your kindness, and I intend to repay it in whatever way I can until the agency writes back." "You do not owe me anything." "I disagree." She met his eyes across the table, and there was something fierce in her gaze that he had not seen before, a flash of the woman beneath the careful composure. "You did not have to help me. You chose to. That is not nothing, Mr. Walden. In my experience, most people do not choose the ones who are easy to overlook." Homer set down his fork. "Is that what happened back there, in Ohio, before you came out here?" Nellie was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of her plate. "I was the youngest of 4 sisters," she said finally. "The other 3 were married by the time they were 19, 20 at the latest. Pretty things, all of them, with easy laughs and golden hair. I was the plain one. The clever one, my father used to say, as though that was meant to be a comfort. Clever girls do not get chosen, Mr. Walden. They get left to keep house for their aging parents while their sisters raise families of their own. That does not sound like much of a life for a young woman." "It was not," she said simply. "When my mother passed and my father followed 2 years later, I found myself alone with no prospects and no inheritance to speak of. The advertisement for brides seemed like the only door left open to me. I thought perhaps out here, where men are scarce and women scarcer still, I might finally be chosen for something. Instead, I learned that even out here, in a land as wide and empty as this, a woman can still be found wanting." Homer felt something twist in his chest, something he did not have a name for yet, though it burned low and steady like the coals of a good fire. "Silas Crandall is a fool," he said, "and not a small one. Any man who would look at you and see nothing worth having has got something wrong with his eyes or his heart, or both." Nellie looked up at him, startled by the conviction in his voice. "You hardly know me, Mr. Walden." "I know enough," he said. "I know you held that wire steady today without complaint even when it cut your palm, and I know you did not say a word about it until I noticed the blood myself. I know you have cooked better meals in 3 days than I have managed in 3 years on my own. I know you speak plainly and do not simper or flatter, and I have found, in my experience, that plain speech is worth 10 times the pretty words some folks trade in." He paused, seeming almost surprised by his own speech, and cleared his throat. "That is what I know. It seems like plenty to me." Nellie did not know what to say to that. She looked down at her hands, at the small cut across her palm that she had indeed tried to hide, and felt a warmth rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. "You are kind to say so," she said quietly. "I am not being kind," Homer said. "I am being honest. There is a difference." The letter from the Cheyenne agency arrived 8 days later, carried out from town by a writer who also brought news that set the whole valley talking. There had been trouble at the Bar T Ranch to the west, cattle run off in the night, and suspicion had fallen on a band of Lakota who had been seen moving through the territory following the buffalo herds that grew scarcer every year. The writer spoke of it with the casual contempt Nellie had already learned to expect from certain quarters, but Homer's face had darkened at the words. "That is not the way of it," he said, once the writer had gone on toward town. "I have known Chief Iron Cloud and his people for near 10 years now. They have never taken so much as a stray calf from my herd, and I do not believe they took the Bar T's cattle either. More likely it was rustlers using the unrest as cover, same as always. But try telling that to men who want someone to blame." "You know them, the Lakota?" Nellie asked, surprised. "My father traded fairly with them when he first settled this land before I was born. Land that by every right of decency belonged to them long before any surveyor ever staked a claim on it. He believed a man ought to deal honestly regardless of what treaty or war might say, and I have tried to carry that forward. Iron Cloud has been a good neighbor to this ranch, better than some of the white men in Larkspur, if I am honest. It grieves me to see how his people have been pushed and cheated and blamed for troubles they did not cause. Also, others might have an excuse to take what little land is left to them." Nellie thought of her own recent humiliation, the casual cruelty of Silas Crandall on the platform, and found herself nodding slowly. It seems the world is full of people looking for someone smaller than themselves to blame for their own troubles. It surely is, Homer agreed grimly. But that does not make it right, and I will not stand quiet while it happens on land I call home. The letter from the agency, when Homer finally handed it to her, was brief and unhelpful. It stated that Mr. Crandall's refusal to honor the arrangement had created a complication the agency was unprepared for, that no other rancher in the region had come forward requesting a bride, and that Miss Shelton was welcome to return east at the agency's expense, or to make her own arrangements in the territory as she saw fit. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the humiliation she had endured, only the cold arithmetic of a business transaction gone wrong. Nellie read it twice, then set it down on the table with hands that trembled only slightly. "I do not wish to return east," she said. "There is nothing there for me now. No family, no home, only the memory of being the daughter nobody quite wanted to keep." "Then do not go," Homer said simply. "Mr. Walden, I cannot continue to live in your house as a guest indefinitely. It is not proper, and it is not fair to you." "Then let us make it proper," Homer said, and his voice, though steady, carried an undertone she had not heard from him before, something almost nervous beneath the calm. Nellie looked up at him, uncertain she had understood him correctly. "What do you mean?" Homer stood from the table, walked to the window, and looked out at the darkening fields for a long moment before he spoke again. "I mean, Miss Shelton, that in the 8 days you have been under this roof, I have come to think that whatever fool arrangement brought you west, it was not so foolish after all. I mean that I have watched you work this land alongside me without complaint, watched you laugh at Biscuit's foolishness, watched you tend that cut on your hand without a word of self-pity, and I have found myself thinking, more often than I care to admit, that this house has felt more like a home in 8 days than it has in the 3 years since my mother passed." He turned to face her. "I am not a man of many words, and I do not know the proper way to court a lady, having never had cause to try. But I know this. I would be a fool twice over if I let you walk away from this ranch and back east to nothing, when I have got a home and a heart both with room enough for you in them." Nellie's breath caught in her throat. "Mr. Walden, you hardly need a wife you have known but a week and a half. You could have your pick of any woman in the territory." "I do not want any woman in the territory," Homer said, crossing the room to stand before her. "I want the one who was told she was never meant to be chosen, so that I might have the particular honor of proving that whoever told her so was a liar and a fool. Nellie." It was the first time he had used her Christian name, and it seemed to change the air between them. "You said you were never meant to be chosen. I am asking you to let me choose you now, freely and with my whole heart, not because there is no one else, but because there is no one else I want." Tears stood in Nellie's eyes, but she did not look away from him. "Homer," she said, testing his name in her own mouth for the first time and finding that she liked the shape of it. "I do not know if I know how to be chosen. I have spent so long expecting to be left." "Then we will learn together," he said, and he reached out and took her hand, the one with the small healing cut across the palm, and pressed his lips gently to it. "I am not asking for an answer tonight. I know this is sudden, and I know you have had precious little reason to trust a man's word of late, but I wanted you to know where I stand before another day passed." Nellie looked down at their joined hands, at the roughness of his palm against hers, and felt something unclench in her chest that had been tight and guarded since the moment Silas Crandall had turned his back on her at the depot. "I do not need time," she said softly. "I have spent my whole life waiting to be wanted, Homer Walden, and I find I am tired of waiting. If you mean what you say, then say it again, and I will give you my answer." Homer's eyes searched her face, and finding nothing there but honesty, he drew a steadying breath. "Nellie Shelton, I choose you. Not because the agency sent you to me, not because Silas Crandall was too great a fool to see what stood before him, but because in this short time you have become dearer to me than I know how to say. I choose you today, and I will choose you again tomorrow and every day after that for as long as you will let me." "Then yes," Nellie whispered, and the word felt like a door opening after years of standing shut. "Yes, Homer, I will marry you." He kissed her then, gently, as though she were something precious and easily frightened away, and she found herself leaning into it, into him, into the first embrace she had ever received that felt like it was given freely and not out of obligation or pity. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Larkspur, with Reverend Pike presiding and a gathering of Homer's neighbors filling the pews, ranchers and their wives who had known Homer since he was a boy and who had watched, with growing curiosity, the courtship that had bloomed so quickly at the Walden ranch. Nellie wore a dress of pale blue muslin that she and Homer's nearest neighbor, a warm and talkative woman named Mrs. Ada Kessler, had sewn together over the preceding weeks, and she carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that Homer himself had picked from the fields that morning, his fingers stained faintly green from the effort. Word had traveled, as word does in small territories, and Silas Crandall himself stood at the back of the church, drawn perhaps by curiosity or perhaps by some flicker of shame, watching as the woman he had rejected walked down the aisle toward a man who looked at her as though she were the answer to a question he had not known he was asking. Nellie caught his eye once briefly and felt nothing but a distant pity for him, a man who had let pride blind him to what stood plainly before him. She turned her gaze forward toward Homer and did not look back again. "Do you, Homer Walden, take this woman to be your lawful wife?" Reverend Pike asked. "I do," Homer said, his voice clear and unwavering, "and I will keep choosing her every day for as long as I have breath to say it." The vows were simple, the ceremony brief as was common in a territory where daylight and work waited for no man, but the feeling in the small church was as full and warm as any grand cathedral wedding Nellie might have imagined in her girlhood dreams. When Homer lifted her veil and kissed her as his wife, the small congregation erupted into applause, and somewhere near the back, even Silas Crandall found himself clapping, though whether from genuine goodwill or simple social obligation, no one could say. That evening, back at the ranch, Mrs. Kessler and several other neighboring wives had arranged a small celebration, tables set up in the yard laden with roasted chicken and fresh bread, and a cake that Mrs. Kessler had baked specially, its top decorated with wild roses. Homer and Nellie danced together under the darkening sky to the music of a fiddle played by one of the ranch hands from a neighboring spread, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Nellie felt not merely tolerated or accommodated, but truly and wholly wanted. "I still cannot quite believe it," she confessed later that night, as they stood together on the porch watching the last of the guests depart in their wagons, lanterns swinging like fireflies into the darkness. "A month ago I was sitting on a bench in Larkspur, certain my life was over before it had properly begun. And now?" Homer asked, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "And now I am standing on my own porch, married to a man who chose me not once but twice, and I find I do not know how to hold so much happiness at one time." She laughed softly, and the sound of it, unguarded and genuine, filled something in Homer's chest that he had not known was empty. "You will learn," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "We have got the whole rest of our lives to practice." The seasons turned, as seasons do, and the Walden ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Nellie proved to have a natural talent not only for the domestic arts, but for the business of ranching itself, keeping careful books and negotiating shrewdly with the buyers who came each autumn to purchase cattle for shipment east. Homer found himself relying on her counsel more and more, not out of necessity, but out of genuine respect for her sharp mind. The very cleverness her father had once treated as a burden now proving to be one of her greatest gifts. Their friendship with Chief Ironclad's people deepened as well. In the autumn of that first year, when a harsh early frost threatened to destroy a portion of the Walden hay crop, it was members of Ironclad's band who came to help, showing Homer and Nellie methods of protecting the cut hay that had been passed down through generations of living on this land. In turn, Homer shared what surplus grain and supplies he could spare when winter came hard the following year, and the friendship between the ranch and the band grew into something that felt, to both Homer and Nellie, like a small act of resistance against the greater injustices being done to the Lakota people across the territory, injustices that Homer never stopped speaking against, quietly but firmly, whenever the subject arose among his neighbors. "It is not enough," he told Nellie one evening, some 2 years into their marriage, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the grass gold and red. "What is happening to them, the way the government keeps shrinking their land, keeps breaking every promise it ever made? I cannot fix that, not with fair trading and a few sacks of grain, but I will not pretend it is not happening, and I will not treat them as anything less than the good neighbors they have been to us." "That is more than most men in this territory can say," Nellie replied, resting her head against his shoulder. "You cannot right every wrong in the world, Homer, but you can refuse to add to them. That counts for something." It was around this time that Nellie discovered she was carrying their first child, a discovery that filled the ranch house with a new kind of joy neither of them had anticipated. Homer, ever practical, immediately set about building an addition to the house, a proper nursery with a window facing east so that morning light would wake the child gently. Nellie, for her part, spent long evenings sewing tiny garments, her fingers steady despite the fluttering nervousness in her chest. "Do you suppose it will be a boy or a girl?" she asked one night, her hand resting on the growing curve of her belly. "I do not much care, so long as it is healthy and has got your good sense instead of my stubbornness," Homer replied, and Nellie laughed and swatted at him playfully, though she pulled him close afterward and kissed him in a way that left them both breathless. Their son, whom they named Thomas after Homer's father, was born on a cold morning in January of 1880, delivered with the help of Mrs. Kessler and a midwife summoned from town, while Homer paced the hall outside in an agony of helplessness that dissolved entirely the moment he was allowed to hold his son for the first time. He wept unashamed, cradling the tiny bundle against his chest, and looked up at Nellie with an expression of such raw wonder that she felt her own heart might burst from the fullness of it. "He is perfect," Homer whispered. "Look at him, Nellie. He is absolutely perfect." "He has got your nose," Nellie said, exhausted but glowing, poor thing. "He is lucky to have it," Homer said, and pressed a kiss to his wife's forehead, then to his son's tiny brow, and the three of them remained there together as the winter light strengthened outside the window, a small family formed from what had once seemed like an unlikely, unwanted beginning. 2 years after Thomas's birth, their daughter Ruth arrived in the height of summer, born during a thunderstorm that rattled the windows and sent Biscuit, now considerably older and grayer around the muzzle, cowering beneath the kitchen table. Ruth came into the world with a fierce cry that made Homer laugh even in the tension of the moment, declaring that she would grow up to be just as strong-willed as her mother, a prediction that would prove entirely accurate in the years that followed. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Homer expanded the herd, added new grazing land purchased fairly from a retiring neighbor, and built a proper schoolhouse on land he donated at the edge of town, insisting that all the children of the valley deserved an education, including the children of the Lakota families who camped nearby during certain seasons, an arrangement that raised some eyebrows among the more narrow-minded of Larkspur's citizens, but which Homer defended without apology or hesitation. Education ought not to be a privilege reserved for some children and denied to others based on the color of their skin or the shape of their history, he told the town council when the matter was debated, his voice carrying the same quiet conviction that had first drawn Nellie to him on that bench outside the telegraph office years before. "I will not have my children learning their letters in a schoolhouse that turns away their neighbors." The measure passed, narrowly, and the schoolhouse opened its doors to all children of the valley who wished to attend, a small but meaningful crack in the wall of prejudice that had long divided the settlers from the people whose land they had claimed as their own. Nellie, for her part, found herself teaching at the schoolhouse 2 days a week when her own children were old enough to attend, discovering in herself a passion for education she had not known she possessed. The clever girl who had once been told cleverness would not get her chosen found in the end, that her sharp mind and her love of learning had become one of the great gifts of her adult life, shared freely with the children of the valley, regardless of their circumstance or heritage. It was in the spring of 1884, 6 years after that first fateful ride from Larkspur, that trouble came to the Walden Ranch in a form neither Homer nor Nellie had anticipated. A group of cattle rustlers, emboldened by the general unrest that had plagued the territory in recent years, made a run at the Walden herd under cover of darkness, cutting fences and attempting to drive off nearly 200 head of prime cattle. Homer, woken by the commotion, grabbed his rifle and rode out into the night with 2 of his hired hands, while Nellie, heart pounding with fear for her husband's safety, gathered the children into the root cellar for safe keeping and waited in agonized suspense for news. The rustlers, it turned out, were a rough band of men who had drifted into the territory from further west, men with no ties to the land and no scruples about whose property they claimed as their own. In the confused struggle that followed, shots were fired, though thankfully none found their mark on Homer or his men. It was, in fact, the timely arrival of several riders from Iron Cloud's band, who had been camped nearby and heard the commotion, that turned the tide of the confrontation, their numbers and their evident willingness to fight sending the rustlers scattering into the darkness without their stolen cattle. "I owe you my life, and my herd besides," Homer told Iron Cloud the following morning, as the 2 men surveyed the damaged fence line together. "I do not know how I will ever repay such a debt." Iron Cloud, a man of perhaps 50 years with deep lines etched into his face by decades of hardship and endurance, regarded Homer with quiet dignity. "You have paid it many times over already, Homer Walden. In the years you have dealt fairly with my people when so many others dealt only in lies and theft. We do not keep such careful ledgers between friends." Nellie, standing nearby with baby Ruth on her hip and young Thomas clutching her skirts, felt tears prick her eyes at the simple honesty of the exchange, a testament to the kind of friendship that had grown between the ranch and the band over the years, built on nothing more than mutual respect and the refusal, on Homer's part, to see injustice and look away. The rustlers were later apprehended by the territorial marshal some 50 miles east, and the stolen cattle from the Bar T Ranch, taken years before and long since sold off, were revealed at last to have been the work of this same band, clearing the name of Iron Cloud's people from the false accusations that had dogged them for years. It was a small vindication, long overdue, but Homer made certain the truth was spoken plainly in Larkspur, standing before the same town council that had once debated the schoolhouse question, and declaring that an injustice allowed to stand uncorrected was an injustice repeated with every day of silence. The years continued to unfold, gentle and full, marked by the small triumphs and occasional sorrows that make up the fabric of any well-lived life. A 3rd child, a boy they named Charles after Nellie's own father, arrived in 1886, followed by a 4th, a daughter named Grace, in 1889, rounding out the Walden family to 6 souls gathered beneath one roof, a roof that had once sheltered only a lonely widower, and now rang daily with the laughter and occasional squabbling of 4 growing children. Nellie often thought back, in quiet moments, to that day on the bench in Larkspur, to the crushing weight of rejection she had carried west with her father's voice echoing in her memory, telling her that clever girls did not get chosen. She thought of Silas Crandall's cruel laugh, and the way it had nearly convinced her that she was destined to live a life of quiet, overlooked service to others, never at the center of anyone's affection. She thought of these things not with bitterness, but with a kind of gentle wonder at how far she had traveled, both in miles and in the measure of her own heart. The woman who had once believed herself unchoosable now found herself at the very center of a family's love, a community's respect, and a husband's unwavering devotion that had only deepened with every passing year. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked Homer one evening in the autumn of 1890, as they sat together on the porch that had witnessed so many of the quiet, important moments of their life together, watching their children play some game of their own invention in the yard below. Thomas, now 10 years old and lanky as a young colt, Ruth 8 and fierce as her father had predicted, Charles 4 and toddling determinedly after his older siblings, and baby Grace asleep in Nellie's arms. "Think about what?" Homer asked, though something in his tone suggested he knew already what she meant. "That first day, the bench outside the telegraph office, what might have happened if you had not come looking for me?" Homer was quiet for a long moment, watching his children in the golden light of the setting sun. "I think about it often," he admitted finally. "Not with fear exactly, but with a kind of gratitude that near frightens me with its size. I think about how close I came to simply collecting my wire and nails and riding home without ever hearing your name, and I think about how different this porch would look tonight if I had." "It would look quite empty, I imagine," Nellie said softly. "It would look like a house, not a home," Homer corrected. "There is a considerable difference, as I believe I mentioned to you once before, a long time ago." He reached over and took her hand, the same hand he had once kissed on the night he first asked her to be his wife, though the palm had long since healed and grown rougher still from years of shared labor on the ranch. "I chose you once at that depot, and I chose you again at this very table, and I have found myself choosing you anew every single day since, sometimes without even realizing I was doing it, simply because the choosing became as natural to me as breathing. And I chose to let myself be chosen," Nellie said, her voice thick with emotion, "which was, I think, the harder thing for me to learn. I had spent so long expecting to be passed over that I hardly knew how to accept it when someone finally reached for me and meant to keep me." "You learned quickly enough," Homer said, a smile touching the corner of his mouth. "4 children and a ranch bearing witness to how thoroughly you learned it." Nellie laughed, the sound carrying out across the yard where her children played, oblivious to the depth of feeling passing between their parents on the porch above them. Ruth looked up at the sound, grinned, and waved before returning to whatever elaborate game she and her brother had constructed from sticks and imagination. A scene of ordinary, unremarkable happiness that Nellie knew, with the particular clarity of a woman who has known its absence, to be the rarest and most precious thing in all the world. That winter brought a hard freeze to the valley, the kind that tested every rancher's preparations and patience alike. But the Walden Ranch weathered it well, thanks in no small part to the continued friendship with Iron Cloud's band, who shared knowledge of the land's rhythms that Homer had come to value as highly as any lesson learned in his own years of ranching. When spring came at last, thawing the creek and coaxing the first green shoots from the frozen ground, it brought with it also a letter from Ohio, forwarded through several hands before finally reaching the Walden Ranch, from one of Nellie's sisters, the eldest, whom Nellie had not heard from in the 8 years since her departure west. The letter was stiff with formality at first, inquiring after Nellie's health and circumstances in the dry, distant tone of a relation more dutiful than affectionate. But as Nellie read further, something in the letter's tone shifted, softened, and by its final paragraph, her sister had confessed to a certain shame at how the family had treated her, at the ease with which they had dismissed her prospects and her worth simply because she had not shared their easy prettiness or their swift path to marriage. "We heard, eventually, of your marriage to a rancher of some standing," the letter read, "and I confess, Nellie, that the news filled me with an unexpected gladness, mixed with no small measure of guilt for how little any of us ever seemed to believe in your chances at happiness. I hope you will forgive us in time for our blindness. I hope, too, that you might consider writing back, that we might begin to mend what was so carelessly broken." Nellie sat with the letter for a long while after reading it, feeling old wounds ache with a familiar but fading pain. She showed it to Homer that evening, and he read it in silence, his expression carefully neutral until he finished. "What will you do?" he asked, handing it back to her. "I do not know," Nellie admitted. "Part of me wants to write back nothing at all, to let them wonder as I once wondered, standing alone on that platform in Larkspur with no one in the world to claim me. But another part of me thinks that carrying such bitterness serves no purpose but to keep the wound open when it might otherwise heal. What does your heart tell you?" Nellie considered this for a long moment, looking out the window at the fields where their cattle grazed peacefully in the fading light. At the barn, Homer had expanded twice now to accommodate the growing herd. At the schoolhouse visible in the distance where she taught twice weekly. At the whole rich tapestry of a life she had built here, so far from the family that had once made her feel so small. "My heart tells me that I have built something here that no longer needs their approval to feel complete," she said finally. "But I think perhaps I will write back, not because I need their forgiveness or their acknowledgement, but because I have learned, these past 8 years, that choosing kindness even toward those who once wounded us is its own kind of freedom. I do not wish to carry Silas Crandall's cruelty or my family's blindness with me for the rest of my days. I would rather set it down and walk forward unburdened." Homer smiled, pride evident in his eyes. "That is a wiser conclusion than I would have reached myself, I think. I had a good teacher," Nellie said, leaning against his shoulder. "You taught me that choosing does not have to be about deserving. Sometimes it is simply about deciding, and then living out that decision every day after." She did write back to her sister, a letter both honest and generous, describing her life on the ranch, her husband, her children, the community she had built in a place that had once seemed as foreign and unwelcoming as the moon. She did not pretend that the old hurt had vanished entirely, but she offered forgiveness freely, understanding at last that holding onto old grievances would only diminish the richness of the life she had made for herself. A life built not on being chosen by others' approval, but on the deeper, more lasting foundation of a love that had chosen her, deliberately and repeatedly, without condition or reservation. The correspondence with her family continued in the years that followed, tentative at first but growing warmer. And eventually, in the summer of 1893, her eldest sister and her family made the long journey west to visit the Walden Ranch, an occasion that filled Nellie with a complicated mixture of nervousness and hope. But when her sister stepped down from the train in Larkspur and saw Nellie waiting on the platform, no longer the timid, overlooked girl she remembered, but a confident woman flanked by 4 healthy children, and a husband whose devotion was evident in every glance he cast her way, something in her sister's face crumpled with genuine emotion. "You look happy," her sister said, embracing her for the first time in 15 years. "Truly happy, Nellie. I am so glad. I am so very glad." "I am happy," Nellie confirmed, and found that she meant it completely, without qualification or hidden bitterness. "I found what I was looking for in the end. It simply took the shape of something I never expected." The visit passed pleasantly, her sister and brother-in-law marveling at the size and prosperity of the ranch, at the easy affection between Homer and Nellie that spoke of a partnership built on mutual respect rather than mere convenience, at the 4 children who ran wild and happy across the fields with the particular freedom that only ranch life could offer. By the time the visit ended and her sister boarded the train back east, something long broken between them had been, if not entirely mended, at least meaningfully repaired. As the years continued to pass, the Walden Ranch became known throughout the territory not merely for its prosperity, but for the character of the family who ran it. Homer served 2 terms on the territorial council, using his position to advocate consistently for fair treatment of the Lakota communities who remained in the region, for the continued operation of the integrated schoolhouse, for honest dealing in all matters of trade and commerce. Nellie continued teaching, eventually training a new generation of teachers to carry on the work when her own household duties made regular teaching impossible, and she never lost her love of reading, filling the ranch house's shelves with books that she shared freely with her children and with any neighbor who cared to borrow them. Their eldest son Thomas grew into a capable young man, taking to ranch work with the same steady competence his father had shown, while Ruth, true to her father's early prediction, grew fierce and independent, eventually training as a nurse in Cheyenne, one of the first women in the territory to pursue such a path, a decision Homer and Nellie supported wholeheartedly, even as some of their more conservative neighbors clucked their disapproval. "She ought to marry and settle down," old Mrs. Petrie from the next ranch over remarked disapprovingly at a town gathering when Ruth's plans became known. "A young woman ought not to go chasing after such unconventional ambitions." "My daughter will choose whatever life makes her happiest," Nellie replied evenly, "the same as I once wished someone had allowed me the chance to choose for myself, rather than deciding my worth based on how quickly I might be claimed by some man or another. I will not raise my daughter to believe her value depends on anyone's approval but her own good conscience." Mrs. Petrie had no response to that, and word of Nellie's firm defense of her daughter's ambition spread through the valley with the swiftness such things always traveled, cementing Nellie's reputation as a woman who, having once been overlooked and undervalued, would not stand quietly by while the same injustice threatened to be visited upon her own children or anyone else within her sphere of influence. Charles, their second son, showed an early aptitude for mechanical things, eventually apprenticing with a blacksmith in Larkspur before opening his own smithy, a business that thrived as the territory continued to grow and modernize with the approach of the new century. And young Grace, the baby of the family, grew into a gentle, artistic soul who filled the ranch house with sketches and paintings of the surrounding landscape, capturing on paper the same wide skies and rolling grasslands that had once seemed so foreign and frightening to her mother upon her first arrival, but which had become, over the years, simply and completely home. In the autumn of 1898, 20 years after that first fateful meeting outside the telegraph office in Larkspur, Homer and Nellie Walden celebrated their anniversary with a gathering that drew neighbors from across the valley, including several members of Iron Cloud's band, now led by Iron Cloud's own son, following the elder chief's passing some years before. The friendship between the families having endured and strengthened across 2 generations, despite all the pressures and injustices that had sought to prevent such bonds from forming. Standing on the porch that evening, watching the celebration unfold in the yard below, Homer wrapped his arms around his wife from behind, resting his chin atop her head in a gesture so familiar after 2 decades of marriage that it required no thought at all. 20 years, he murmured. "I still remember the exact words you said to me, that first day. I was never meant to be chosen." "And I remember what you said back," Nellie replied, turning in his embrace to face him, her eyes, though touched now with the fine lines of age and laughter both, still holding the same clear intelligence that had first drawn his attention on that lonely bench so many years before. "Then I will choose you twice. I believe I have made good on that promise," Homer said, "many thousands of times over by my count." "You have," Nellie agreed, "and I intend to hold you to it for however many years we have left to us." "You will not need to hold me to anything," Homer said, pulling her closer. "The choosing has become as natural to me as my own heartbeat. I could not stop now even if I wished to, and I have never once wished to, not for a single day of these 20 years." Below them in the yard, their children moved among the gathered guests. Thomas now married himself with a young wife and infant son of his own, carrying forward the Walden name into a new generation. Ruth had returned from Cheyenne for the celebration, now a respected nurse with stories of her own hard-won accomplishments to share. Charles brought his young sweetheart, a girl from town whom he clearly hoped to marry before the year was out, and Grace, now 19 and blossoming into a talented artist whose work had begun to attract notice even beyond the territory, sketched the scene before her with quick, confident strokes, capturing for posterity the warm golden light of an autumn evening filled with laughter and love, and the particular contentment that comes only from a life well and faithfully lived. Nellie looked out over this scene, this family and community she had built from what had once seemed like the wreckage of her deepest hopes, and felt her heart swell with a gratitude too large for words. She thought of the frightened, humiliated young woman who had sat on that bench in Larkspur, certain her life was effectively over before it had properly begun, and she wished, with a tenderness that surprised her even now, that she could reach back across the years and tell that young woman that everything would be all right, that the very worst day of her life would prove to be the doorway to the very best. "Thank you," she whispered to Homer, so quietly that the words were nearly lost beneath the sound of the fiddle music and laughter drifting up from the yard. "For what?" he asked, though something in his eyes suggested he already understood. "For choosing me, then and every day since, for proving that man on the platform wrong, and for teaching me that being chosen was never about deserving it in the first place. It was simply about finding the one person whose heart recognized mine before I even knew to look for it myself." Homer kissed her then, gently, the same way he had kissed her on the night he first proposed, and though 20 years and 4 children and countless seasons of hardship and triumph had passed between that first kiss and this one, the feeling remained exactly the same, warm and certain and utterly complete. "I will choose you tomorrow, too," he murmured against her lips, "and every day after that, for as long as we both shall live." "Then I suppose," Nellie said, smiling against his mouth, "we have got quite a lot more choosing left to do." They remained on that porch a while longer, watching the celebration below, the music and laughter of their children and grandchildren and neighbors and friends rising up to meet them like a promise fulfilled, a testament to everything that could grow from a single act of unexpected kindness offered to a stranger on a lonely bench, so many years before. The sun set slowly over the wide Wyoming grassland, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and gold and deepening purple, and beneath that vast and generous sky, Homer Walden and Nellie Shelton Walden stood together, exactly where they had always been meant to be, chosen and choosing again and again, for as long as their story continued to unfold. In the years that followed, their family continued to grow and flourish. Thomas took over increasing responsibility for the ranch's daily operations, allowing Homer to spend his later years in the comfortable role of advisor rather than laborer, though he never fully surrendered his love of working alongside his son, and eventually, his grandchildren in the fields he had tended for so many decades. Ruth married a doctor she met through her nursing work, and together they established a small clinic in Larkspur that served the whole valley, including, at Ruth's insistence, the Lakota families who had once been turned away from proper medical care by less enlightened practitioners. Charles married his sweetheart the following spring, and his smithy grew into one of the most respected businesses in the growing town, eventually training apprentices of his own who would carry the trade forward into the new century. Grace's artistic talents took her briefly to study in Denver, but she returned always to the wide skies and open grasslands of her childhood home, finding in the Wyoming landscape an endless source of inspiration that no city, however grand, could ever fully replace. Nellie continued teaching well into her later years, watching with quiet pride as generation after generation of valley children, of every background and circumstance, passed through the schoolhouse doors she had fought to keep open to all. And Homer, true to the promise he had made on that first night of their courtship, never stopped choosing her, in 10,000 small ways across the remainder of their long and richly lived lives together, proving again and again that love, properly given and properly received, was never about deserving or destiny, but simply about the daily, deliberate choice to hold fast to what mattered most, through every season and every circumstance that life might bring. They grew old together on that ranch beside Rattlesnake Creek, surrounded by children and grandchildren, by the friendship of neighbors both settler and Lakota alike, by the wide Wyoming sky that had witnessed every joy and sorrow of their shared life. And when Nellie thought back in her final years to that bitter day on the platform in Larkspur, she found she could summon no bitterness at all, only a deep and abiding gratitude that the worst moment of her life had led her, by paths she could never have predicted, to the very best. She had been told she was never meant to be chosen. But Homer Walden had chosen her, not once, but every single day for the rest of their lives together. And in that choosing, freely given and freely returned, they had built a love story that neither time nor hardship nor the cruelty of a single foolish man on a train platform could ever diminish or undo.